The chairman of the Gyumga syndicate hadn't spoken in 3 months, couldn't lift his hands, couldn't stand, and his wife had already started making calls to the lieutenants about the transfer of power. What Minji didn't know was that her husband had been fully recovered for 2 weeks. He had read every note the maid slipped him in the dark. He knew exactly who had saved him and exactly who had tried to bury him. And he had been sitting in that wheelchair, watching, waiting, and building a list. And tonight, at the banquet she had arranged to take his throne, he was finally going to stand up. Subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you just to know how far our story is going. The bedroom smelled of lilies and slow death. Not natural death. Designed death. There is a difference, and Melina knew it the way you know things that have been taught to you by someone who understood that knowledge was survival. She was on her knees. Gray uniform. White apron. Scrubbing brush moving in slow circles across Italian marble that cost more than her entire nursing degree back in Lagos. 6 weeks in this house had taught her one rule above all others. The safest thing a maid could be was invisible. A shadow with a mop, a pair of hands without a face. So nobody watched her. And that was exactly how she watched everything. The lilies were freshly replaced every morning. The candles were imported French wax, vanilla, and cedar. The entire room had been constructed, she now understood, to smell like grief before the grief arrived. Like a stage dressed for a funeral that had not yet been announced. She kept her brush moving. Minji's heels announced her before the door opened. That precise, deliberate click, the walk of a woman who had calculated every step she had ever taken. She entered wrapped in deep red silk, gold at her ears and throat and wrists, carrying a small porcelain tray with a single, steaming cup on it. Evening tea. It was always evening tea. She moved to her husband's side with the practiced grace of a devoted woman, set the tray down, touched his cheek with 2 fingers. Not a caress. An inspection. The way you press fruit at the market to test if it has softened enough. Yobo, she said softly. Husband. The word rolled off her tongue like silk over a blade. Drink while it's warm. She lifted the cup to his lips. He drank. She smiled. That beautiful, expensive smile that never once reached her eyes, and left the room on those precise heels without looking back. The steam from the cooling cup drifted across the room. Melina breathed it in, and the world stopped. She thought she was just a maid doing her job. She was so wrong about what she was actually doing, it almost cost him his life. Her grandmother's voice came to her across 12 years and 4,000 kilometers of ocean, sharp and present as if the old woman were crouched beside her on the marble floor. Oleander smells sweet, my child, like almonds left too long in the sun. That sweetness is the lie. Underneath it, underneath, there is always the rot. Almond, rot, sweet. Then wrong. Melina's hands went flat on the floor. She did not move. She did not look up. She did not make a single sound. But behind her empty expression, her mind was already running. Systematic, clinical, precise. Nerium oleander. Every part of it lethal. The cardiac glycosides attacking the heart's electrical system, slowing the muscles, mimicking in prolonged low doses the progressive deterioration of a serious neurological condition. Slow enough to look like God's design rather than a wife's. She looked at Beomsiak, the frailty, the tremors, the gray skin, the silk pajamas hanging off bones that had once filled a suit that made men step aside in hallways. For the first time since arriving in this house, she did not see a sick man. She saw a design. The most powerful man in Seoul was not dying from a disease. He was being hunted, in his own chair, by his own wife, with a cup of tea, and every doctor in the city had signed the wrong death certificate before the man had even stopped breathing. Nobody had smelled it, nobody except the woman on the floor. The healer's code, African women in Korean households and the knowledge systems they carry that nobody counts. Everyone said he was too far gone to save. That's exactly why she decided to find out for herself. The house changed at 2 in the morning. Security rotation switched at 1:45. Melina had memorized it in her third week without consciously deciding to, her body cataloging danger the way it had learned to in every environment that required survival. There was a 4-minute gap between the East Corridor patrol and the return sweep. 4 minutes of unwatched staircase. She had spent 2 weeks sitting on that knowledge without using it. Tonight she used it. Soft. Shoes. Pen torch. And the stethoscope she had kept folded in a sock at the bottom of her bag since the day she landed in Korea. Because she could not be a nurse here, the licensing laws had made certain of that, but she could not stop being one either. Some things you did not put down just because a system told you to. His door was unlocked. Minji locked her own suite. Biom Seok's was left open. Melina had noted this detail weeks ago with a feeling she could now name: deliberate cruelty. An unlocked door for a man who could not walk through it. She crossed to his bed in the thin blue stripe of city light coming through the curtain gap. Stood over him. Watched the shallow rise and fall of his chest. The visible effort of it. A body working too hard for the simple act of breathing. 2 fingers to his wrist. She counted. Held her breath. The arrhythmia was unmistakable, the characteristic disruption of a heart whose electrical system had been interfered with, not damaged, not diseased, interfered with. Deliberately, consistently, over weeks. She lifted one eyelid with her thumb and shone the torch. Pupils sluggish. Neural pathways dragging like something thick was moving through them. She checked the second. The same. She stood up straight in the dark of the room of the most dangerous man in Seoul and held the full weight of what she was now carrying. She was a foreigner. Undocumented in the medical sense, her Nigerian license worth nothing here. Her years of training reduced by paperwork to the status of a woman with a mop. If she reported this, who listened to the maid? If Minji suspected her, she disappeared the way people disappeared in houses like this. Quietly, without paperwork. He was not going to survive another month at the current dosing rate. Melina left the room without a sound, but she had already made her decision before she reached the bottom of the staircase. Not on my watch. New girl strategy. A. Stay invisible and let the man die. Strategy B. Use everything your grandmother ever taught you and fight a war nobody knows you're fighting. She chose B, and she chose it alone. Itaewon on a Saturday morning was the closest Seoul had to the organized chaos she had grown up inside. A dozen cuisines competing in the air. Multilingual signage. Faces the rest of this city rarely offered. She moved through it with her head uncovered and her shoulders back, carrying a fabric bag and a list written in the margins of her Bible. The one place in her room no one would look. Auntie Comfort's shop was narrow and dense, presided over by a Ghanaian woman who had been in Seoul 11 years and who looked at Melina the way women of certain age and experience looked at young African women arriving in complicated situations, with full understanding and no wasted questions. Activated charcoal, Melina said quietly. Dried hawthorn berries, dandelion root, milk thistle, fresh ginger. The old kind, not the market. Kind. Auntie Comfort began pulling things from shelves without a word. Strong herbs, she said finally, wrapping roots in brown paper. Strong problem, Melina replied. She paid cash and took the subway home. After midnight, door locked, towel pressed against the gap at the bottom, she laid everything out on her small table by lamplight. Her hands moved with the muscle memory of her grandmother's kitchen, the compound in Ibadan at dusk, the old woman's voice deliberate and patient, passing something forward on purpose because she had known, in the way certain women know things, that it would be needed. The charcoal would bind the glycosides. The hawthorn and herbs would support his cardiac rhythm, reduce the toxic accumulation, give his body the room to begin clearing what had been built up in it week by week. It was not a dramatic cure. It was a slow unwinding. The same patience the poison used, directed back against it. She brewed it in her personal kettle. The one the other maids had commented on. Always that unusually dark, strong coffee she made every morning. It smelled exactly like strong coffee. That was precisely what she needed it to smell like. She poured it into her battered metal flask from nursing school and labeled it in Yoruba, in letters no one in this household could read. Grandmother's tea. For the sick. She was winning this operation in silence, until she realized she had exactly 8 seconds to prove it. 3 days of watching Minji's routine. The wife was a creature of precision, and precision, Melina had learned, was both a weapon and a vulnerability. The tea was prepared at 6:15, left to cool for 12 minutes, collected personally by Minji at 6:27. No other hands on the cup. No interference tolerated, except the cook left the kitchen at 6:18 for the medication room next door. 9 minutes. No corridor camera on the counter, no one watching. On the third evening, Melina walked into the kitchen at 6:19. The cup sat on the marble, steaming. The ginseng and underneath it that wrong sweetness, threading through the warm air like a wire pulled too tight. She had practiced the movement 60 times in her room with a cup of water, eyes closed, until her hands could execute it without the involvement of conscious thought. She looked at the door, the corridor, listened. She lifted the cup, poured the contents into the kitchen drain in one smooth motion, filled it to the identical level from her flask, set it back in the exact same position, straightened. Her hands were steady. Her face was empty. 8 seconds. She walked out of the kitchen without looking back, turned the corner, pressed her back against the wall in the staircase shadow, and breathed for the first time in what felt like a very long time. At 6:27, Minji's heels clicked across the kitchen tile. At 6:29, her footsteps ascended the stairs. Melina unclenched her hands, one finger at a time, and went back to the east wing to finish the evening mopping. The most powerful man in Seoul had just drunk medicine instead of poison. He didn't know it yet. 3 weeks ago, he couldn't move a single finger. Now he was squeezing her hand, and it changed everything. 3 days of the swap, then 5. She maintained it with the mechanical calm of someone who had decided to be afraid later, when there was space for it. She monitored him each morning. Color, pulse, the quality of his stillness. Incremental improvements, calibrated to read as a sick man's natural fluctuation. On the morning of the 4th day, he looked for the first time like a man who was sleeping, rather than a man being slowly erased. On the 5th morning, she was assigned to clean his hands. She sat on the low stool beside his chair and took his right hand in both of hers. Worked the cream in from the wrist, careful at the knuckles, with the attention of someone who understood that being touched with genuine care was itself a form of medicine. His hand was large. Even diminished as he was, she could feel in the bone structure and unexpected calluses the history of someone who had built himself from nothing into something the city feared. She was working on his index finger when she felt it. A twitch. Then again. Not involuntary. Deliberate. The index finger pressing down into her palm with the full concentrated effort of someone summoning everything available to them for a single point of contact. Melina went completely still. She did not look up. She controlled her face, but something cracked open in her chest. Relief so acute it arrived as pain, because she had not been certain. She had been operating on training and her grandmother's voice and the ferocious refusal to watch someone die when she had the tools to prevent it. But certainty had not been available to her for 5 days. She had been carrying its absence like a stone. The finger pressed against her palm again. She looked up. His eyes were on her face. Not the glassy vacancy she had watched for 6 weeks. Not the unfocused stare at a window he could not reach. His eyes were dark and sharp and fully present, and they were looking at her, the way he must have looked at people across boardroom tables where decisions were made that the city never knew about. He looked at her like he was already thinking. She held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds, then looked back down at his hand and continued applying the cream with the same careful strokes. As she stood to leave, she let her fingers rest on top of his for 1 second longer than necessary. Barely a breath of contact. She felt him return the pressure. "I know," it said. "I know you know." She picked up her tray and walked to the door. She was already composing the first note. Here is what nobody in that mansion understood. The maid and the Mafia boss had been running a counter-operation for 2 weeks, and not a single person in the building had noticed. The notes became their language. Small squares from the inside cover of her Bible, folded 4 times, slipped into the lining of the cream bottle or tucked beneath his medication tray in the 2-second window when she was the only person in the room. His responses came through the bottle itself. 1 fold different meant yes. 2 folds meant no. The cap at an angle meant urgent. Crude. Precise. Completely invisible to a household full of people who had decided she was furniture. His eyes tracked her now with the focused patience of a man who had stopped drifting and started waiting. She was adjusting his blanket when she decided the time had come for words. She leaned forward as if smoothing a wrinkle near his shoulder and brought her mouth close to his ear. "I know what she is doing." Breath, not sound. "I know exactly what she put in your tea and how long she has been doing it. I've been swapping it for 11 days. You are not sick. You were being killed." Her hands kept moving on the blanket, slow and routine. "I won't let you die." She straightened up, looked at the window, the door, the camera. Clear. Then she looked at him. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen directed at her in a long time. Not gratitude, something older than gratitude. The expression of someone who has been alone in the dark for months and has just heard a voice they can trust. His jaw was working, the muscles making small, frustrated movements. His voice still rebuilding its pathways, still clearing the residue of weeks of poison from the channels that carried it. He could not speak, but she was fluent in what eyes said when mouths could not. And then, 1 tear. From the outer corner of his right eye, not the helpless weeping of a sick man. 1 precise, deliberate tear from someone who had been holding something with both hands and had just been given permission to set it down for a moment. Melina reached out with the corner of his blanket and removed it from his face with the same matter-of-fact efficiency she brought to every task in this house. She picked up her tray, walked to the door. "Rest," she said without turning around. "We have work to do." She made 1 critical error. She healed him too well, too fast. And the wife noticed. The problem with healing someone in secret was that healing was visible. She had managed it carefully, keeping his improvements incremental, calibrated to read as the natural variation of a sick man's days. She had been precise. She had been controlled. But Beom-seok's body, freed from the weight of the poison, was recovering with a velocity that reflected who he had been before. The constitution of someone built for survival over decades of dangerous living. His color was noticeably better. The muscle definition in his hands was returning. She had caught him twice in unobserved moments sitting differently, the spine finding its old alignment, the posture of a man rather than a diminished version of one. Minji noticed on a Thursday. Melina was in the corridor with the linen basket when she heard the wife's voice drop and sharpen. That specific frequency shift she had learned to treat as an alarm. She was already moving toward the doorway when Minji appeared in the frame. "You." Flat, cold. "Come in here." Beom-seok sat in his chair performing his illness with the concentrated discipline of someone who had run an organized crime empire for 15 years. Eyes unfocused, hands still, utterly convincing. Minji circled him like an auditor. "He looks better." "The doctor said—" "I didn't ask you what the doctor said." She stepped closer. Shorter than Melina by several inches, but proximity designed as a threat. "Are you giving him things that aren't authorized?" "No, ma'am." "His color." She was studying him, her eyes running over him with a proprietary coldness that made the linen basket feel suddenly very heavy in Melina's hands. Why does he look less gray? Maybe it's the light, ma'am. The silence that followed had mass. Minji turned and looked at her directly. Melina held the eye contact at precisely the level she had calibrated for this household, not submissive enough to be suspicious, not confident enough to provoke. The eye contact of a maid with nothing to hide because she was nothing worth hiding things from. Get out. She got out. She was halfway down the corridor when she heard Minji summon the cook, and the cold moved through her chest before she had consciously understood why. The tea. She was going to the kitchen. She was going to change something. That evening the tea smelled different. Same ginseng base, same careful construction. But underneath the familiar almond rot of the oleander, there was a second compound. Something bitter and delayed. She identified it from a third-year toxicology module. She had doubled the dose and added a secondary agent. Melina poured it, down the drain, refilled the cup, walked away. Spent that night recalculating by lamplight in the margins of Psalms, rewriting her formula, calculating what she had left in her supply, calculating how many days before she needed to go back to Itaewon without triggering suspicion. She did not sleep. But she did not panic either. She had been afraid every single day in this house. She had learned to work inside the fear rather than wait for it to leave. It never left. She worked anyway. She was losing ground. So she stopped playing defense and handed the most dangerous man in Seoul a weapon. Sunday morning. Linen change. 2 seconds alone in his room. She slipped the note under his pillow with the unhurried movements of someone performing a routine task, collected her basket, and left without changing her pace. She had spent 2 hours on the wording the night before. It had to be simple enough to read in the dark in a single pass. Precise enough to leave no interpretation. D.O. Not drink the evening tea this week. Do not drink anything she brings. When she gives you the cup on Tuesday evening, fake a seizure. Drop the cup. Full body convulsion. 30 seconds. Then stillness. Let her leave the room before you stop. I will handle the rest. Tuesday evening, she positioned herself in the kitchen at 6:15. She heard Minji's heels on the stairs at 6:27. She began counting. At the count of 40, she heard it. The sharp crack of porcelain on marble. Impact, not placement. And then Minji's voice rising in the pitch that even perfectly controlled women cannot manage in genuine moments of shock. The household nurse was called. Footsteps ran. A door opened. A door closed. 2 minutes later, Minji's heels moved down the corridor toward her own suite. The brisk retreating steps of a woman who needed to not be in that room right now, for reasons she could not document. Melina waited 4 minutes, then walked upstairs and knocked twice, soft and even, on his door. He was sitting in his chair with the broken cup on the floor beside him. He was almost smiling, the smallest, coldest, most controlled, almost smile she had ever seen on a human face, directed at the broken porcelain on the floor. The smile of a man who has just confirmed exactly what kind of opponent he is dealing with, and found the confirmation satisfying rather than frightening. She crouched and began collecting the pieces. 2 weeks, she said quietly, without looking up. She is planning something with the syndicate. She is moving faster than we thought. She placed the last shard in her palm and stood. Can you walk? The pause was very brief. The cream bottle on his table was capped at an angle, urgent. She nodded once, pocketed the porcelain, and left. 3 months ago, he couldn't lift his hands. Tonight, he was going to lift an entire empire back into his own. The banquet announcement came 4 days later. Minji called it a health update gathering. Senior syndicate lieutenants, associated partners, a formal dinner at which the chairman would appear briefly to reassure his people. The household mobilized. Melina was assigned to the kitchen and dining room, which meant she would be present for all of it. She understood immediately what this was not. It was not a reassurance dinner. It was a coronation. Minji was going to wheel him out in front of his own men, have him nod his acknowledgement of incapacitation, activate the proxy rights that would transfer formal syndicate authority into her hands. and do it in front of 19 witnesses who would believe they were watching a dying man's final act of dignity. The night before, Melina sat on her bed and wrote the last note. She held it when she was done, thinking about the next 18 hours. His life. Her safety. Deportation waiting on the other side of a single miscalculation. The medical career a licensing system had decided she was not allowed to have because of the country her knowledge came from. Her grandmother's voice, quiet and certain. Stop hiding your power, child. It was not given to you to be hidden. She folded the note, walked to his room, slipped it under his pillow, went back to bed and closed her eyes. The dining room held 19 people that evening, Minji at the head of the table in gold and black, lieutenants arranged along the sides with the attentiveness of men who were calculating. At the far end, positioned slightly apart as if already a relic, Seok in his wheelchair, and moving through the edges of the room with a serving tray and a gray uniform and her eyes down, Melina, absolutely invisible, the way she had practiced for months before she understood what she had been practicing for. Minji spoke, the formal Korean of regret and necessity, the language of a woman shouldering a burden she had not asked for. The room listened. The tension was the particular kind that gathered when everyone understood a line was about to be crossed that could not be uncrossed. Minji's hand moved toward the gavel, her fingers closed around it. And from the far end of the room, there was a sound. Not loud. The mechanical click of wheelchair brakes releasing. Then the sound of the chair pushed back from the table. It was somehow the loudest thing that had happened in the room all evening. Because it was wrong. The chair was not supposed to move. His hands were not supposed to have the strength. Every person at that table registered the wrongness of it before they had consciously processed what they were hearing. The room went silent. Seok placed both hands on the armrests. He stood up. Not a performance, not a dramatic gesture. He simply stood the way a man stands when he is finished sitting, with the unhurried certainty of someone who identified the precise correct moment weeks ago and has been waiting, with perfect patience, for it to arrive. He straightened to his full height. And she had not understood from the wheelchair how tall he actually was. The silk pajamas were gone. He was wearing a black suit that fit him like a declaration, and his face was the face from the portraits in the corridor. Sharp and cold and completely, terrifyingly awake. Nobody moved. Minji's hand was still on the gavel. He looked at her from across the length of the table, and the quality of that look made two lieutenants push their chairs back instinctively. The way you moved away from something before your conscious mind had finished deciding to. Then he turned his head and looked directly at Melina. She had stopped moving, serving tray in hand, white apron, the uniform of invisibility. He looked at her the way he had looked at her in the dark when the tear moved down his face, but different now, the full weight of who he was, restored and directed at her, like a beam of held light. He extended his hand. Not a summons, an invitation. Offered in front of 19 witnesses, with the full deliberate intention of a man who understood exactly what he was declaring. Melina set her tray on the sideboard. She walked the length of the room and she did not look down. She took his hand and stood beside him, and his grip was complete and certain. Nothing like the careful squeeze of a man in recovery. The grip of someone fully present, fully restored, fully aware of what it meant to position her here, at his side, in front of everything he commanded. In Korean organizational culture, where you stand beside a chairman in a room full of his men says everything. It is not a gesture, it is a declaration. Every person in that room understood what he was saying before he said a single word. He began to speak. His voice came back into the room like weather. Low, absolute, carrying the authority of someone who had never actually lost it, only held it in reserve. She caught pieces of it from her Korean and read the rest from the faces of the people listening. The color draining from certain faces, certain lieutenants straightening with something that looked very much like relief, one associated partner turning to look at Minji and then looking away again, very quickly. He spoke for several minutes. A lieutenant rose and walked to Minji and spoke to her quietly. She sat without moving, the gavel still under her hand. Her face, that beautiful, expensive, impeccably maintained face, was cracking at the edges in a way no amount of training and composure could entirely prevent. Then Beom-seok said something that shifted the entire room. He turned to Melina, and she understood what came next because it was her name in his mouth for the first time. Melina. He said it the way you said the name of someone who reached into the dark and pulled you out of it. He told them everything, the poison, the swap, the notes hidden in cream bottles and medication trays. The woman who had recognized what no doctor had found, who had used knowledge from a grandmother's compound in Lagos to dismantle a plot constructed in a Seoul mansion, who had risked deportation, disappearance, and death, and conducted a one-woman counter-operation in a gray uniform with a battered metal flask in silence for weeks, while everyone in the building looked through her like she was not there. The room was very quiet. And then Beom-seok did something that made even the oldest men at the table draw a sharp breath. He bowed. Not a small bow. A full, deliberate bow from the chairman of the Goomga Syndicate, the most feared man in Seoul, directed at a maid from Lagos who was still wearing her apron. It lasted long enough that no one in the room could pretend they had not seen it. Long enough that it could not be misread or recontextualized or diminished in the retelling. Long enough to mean exactly, precisely, completely what it meant. Melina stood straight and received it the way her grandmother had taught her to receive things. Offered with full intention, not with deflection, not with smallness, with the dignity of someone who understood that what she had done was worth receiving. The sound from Minji's end of the table was very small. The sound of a gavel set down by a hand that had no more use for it. Two men came and stood beside her chair, and she rose without being asked, because she understood, and whatever she felt in that moment she kept behind her face, and Melina did not watch her leave. When the Queen Falls Korean Syndicate succession stories, and the women at the center of them, she was looking at Seoul through the dining room windows, brilliant and indifferent, going about its night without any knowledge of what had just shifted inside this house. Beom-seok was still holding her hand. He said something quietly in Korean, just for her. And she caught enough of it to understand the shape. Lawyers, license, my personal physician. The rest she would learn in time because she already knew she was not leaving. She looked at the hand holding hers, the hand she had cleaned and medicated and held while it was learning to squeeze back. The hand of a man who had been disappearing and who was now, undeniably, catastrophically, completely present. She thought, "Grandmother, you were right about everything." Outside, Seoul went on glittering, and the story that had begun on her knees on a marble floor, with the smell of almond and rot drifting through expensive lily-scented air, and a woman who had been told in every language available to a system that she did not count, had arrived with the slow, inevitable patience of something that had always known what it was, exactly where it was always going. Not the maid. Never again the maid. The woman who saved the king. Subscribe, comment where you're watching from, and tell me, what was the moment you knew Melina was never just a maid? Because I think you knew before she did.